Who baked this peach cobbler? It's delicious.
The first cool days of autumn had finally reached the Texas frontier. The relentless summer heat had softened, leaving behind crisp mornings scented with cedar, dry grass, and the faint sweetness of ripe peaches gathered before the season ended. Wagons rolled slowly toward the little settlement nestled against the rocky hills west of Fort Griffin, where families from scattered homesteads gathered whenever the church announced a community supper. For people living miles apart, such evenings were more than meals. They were chances to exchange news, settle friendly disagreements, introduce newcomers, and remember that even in a vast frontier, no one truly had to stand alone. Long wooden tables filled the whitewashed church hall. Lanterns hung from rough cedar beams, casting a warm golden glow across patched tablecloths and steaming dishes prepared with care rather than luxury. There were cast-iron pots of beans, roasted quail, fresh biscuits, smoked venison, buttered corn, and preserves made from the last fruits of summer. Children darted between benches while older men debated cattle prices and the coming winter. Women shared recipes, laughed over small mishaps, and admired each other's quilts. The room carried the comfortable hum of neighbors who had learned to depend upon one another. Near the center of the hall stood Alvish Carter. At 34, he was known throughout the surrounding mountains as one of the most dependable timber men in West Texas. Unlike many prosperous men who sought attention, Alvish preferred quiet work. His lumber camp supplied beams for barns, schools, churches, and homes across the frontier. He paid fair wages, kept honest accounts, and refused to cheat either customers or workers. Years spent felling pine and cedar had broadened his shoulders and roughened his hands, yet there was a calmness in his gray eyes that often surprised strangers. He carried himself with steady confidence rather than pride. People respected him because he respected everyone first. As the meal drew to a close, volunteers carried out desserts prepared by different families. Pies, molasses cookies, bread pudding, berry tarts. Then someone placed a cast-iron baking dish near the center of the dessert table, a peach cobbler. Its golden crust shimmered beneath a light brushing of butter. Warm cinnamon drifted gently through the room. Thick peach filling bubbled quietly beneath the flaky topping, sending a fragrance that caused conversations to pause for just a moment. "Now that's something worth saving room for," laughed one rancher. Several people hurried toward it. Within minutes, nearly every serving had disappeared. Alvish accepted a small portion from one of the church volunteers and carried it to an empty chair near the window. He took one careful bite, then another. He stopped chewing. The hall continued buzzing with conversation, but his attention rested entirely on the dessert before him. It wasn't unusually sweet. It wasn't rich with expensive ingredients. Instead, every flavor seemed perfectly balanced. The peaches tasted fresh rather than sugary. The crust remained crisp despite the warm filling beneath it. Even the cinnamon lingered gently without overpowering the fruit. Someone had prepared this with remarkable patience. Not for praise, simply because they believed ordinary people deserved something made well, Alvish looked around the room. "Who baked this peach cobbler?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, yet it carried farther than he intended. Nearby conversations slowed. A few people looked toward the dessert table. Others glanced across the hall. For several seconds, no one answered. Alvish frowned slightly. "I'd like to thank whoever made it." An older woman arranging empty plates smiled politely. "Oh, that would be Mary?" She nodded toward the far corner, over there. Alvish followed her gaze, away from the laughter, away from the crowded tables. A young woman sat quietly beside the window, finishing a cup of tea by herself. She couldn't have been more than 29. Her brown dress had been washed so many times its color had softened almost to gray. Dark hair rested neatly beneath a simple bonnet, with a few loose strands escaping near her cheeks. She wasn't trying to attract attention. In fact, she seemed almost practiced at avoiding it. While everyone else visited together, she quietly gathered empty plates left behind by children before anyone asked. She smiled whenever someone thanked her, then returned to her seat unnoticed. Alvish watched as two women walked past her carrying dishes. Neither stopped to speak. A rancher's wife accepted a folded kitchen towel Mary offered without looking up from her conversation. Another woman borrowed a serving spoon from Mary's basket. She thanked the room generally, not Mary herself. It was a strange thing. No one appeared unkind, yet no one truly saw her either. She was simply expected, like the church tables, like the lanterns, like the fresh bread that somehow always appeared. Useful, reliable, invisible, Alvish stood. He carried his plate across the hall. Several conversations paused as people noticed the wealthy mountain man changing direction. Mary looked up only when his boots stopped beside her chair. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said gently. Her expression held quiet surprise. "Yes, sir. Were you the one who baked the peach cobbler?" She hesitated, almost uncertain whether admitting it mattered. "I did." A small smile crossed Alvish's face. "I hoped so." She blinked. "The peaches were preserved at exactly the right time," he continued. "You didn't hide their flavor beneath too much sugar. The crust stayed crisp, which tells me you let the filling cool before serving it. That takes patience." For the first time that evening, Mary looked genuinely speechless. Most compliments she received were brief. "This tastes nice. Thank you. Would you make another sometime?" No one had ever noticed the work behind it. "You can tell all that?" she asked quietly. Alvish nodded. "My mother baked the same way." He glanced toward the nearly empty baking dish across the room. "She used to say people remember how a meal makes them feel long after they forget what was on the table." Mary lowered her eyes, almost embarrassed. "I've always believed that too." For a brief moment, neither spoke, yet the silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Around them, the supper continued as though nothing unusual had happened. No one realized that a simple question about a peach cobbler had become the first moment in years when someone had looked beyond what Mary made, and truly begun to see the woman herself. For a moment, the sounds of the church hall faded into the background. Laughter still drifted from the long tables, children still chased one another between benches, and someone began humming an old frontier hymn while stacking empty dishes. Yet to Alvish, the room seemed strangely divided. At its center was a lively gathering of neighbors. At its edge sat a woman whose quiet work had helped make the evening possible, though hardly anyone had paused to acknowledge her. "I appreciate you coming over to say that," Mary said softly, folding her hands around her teacup. "Most folks simply enjoy the food, and that's enough." "Is it?" Alvish asked. She considered the question before answering. "It has to be." There was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance, as though she had repeated those words to herself many times over the years. Alvish pulled out the empty chair across from her. "May I?" She nodded. As he sat down, a few curious glances crossed the room. Several people looked toward the corner, surprised that the respected mountain man had chosen to spend his evening there instead of joining the town leaders near the front tables. Neither of them seemed to notice. "What taught you to bake like this?" Alvish asked. "My mother," Mary replied with a faint smile. "She believed every meal carried a little piece of the person who prepared it. She used to tell me that if you cooked with patience, people would leave the table feeling cared for, even if they couldn't explain why." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was. And your father. He kept a small peach orchard before we came west. Not a large one, just enough trees to keep our family busy. Every harvest, Mother would preserve peaches for winter. Nothing was wasted." She glanced toward the nearly empty cobbler dish. "When I make that recipe, it reminds me of home." Alvish listened carefully. He had spoken with many people over the years, businessmen, settlers, merchants, ranchers, but few carried the quiet steadiness that Mary did. She answered without trying to impress anyone. Every sentence was simple, honest, and thoughtful. "Do you bake often?" he asked. "For church gatherings, weddings, new babies?" "When someone loses a family member." She shrugged gently. "Any time a meal might help. And people pay you?" A small laugh escaped her. "Oh no, why not?" She looked almost surprised by the question. "Because they usually need the food more than I need the money." Across the hall, Pastor Whitmore approached, carrying a tray of empty cups. "There you are, Mary," he said warmly. "I was wondering where the extra towels came from. I left them by the kitchen door." "I should have guessed." He smiled gratefully before hurrying away to help clean. Alvish noticed something. The pastor had thanked her, but even he had spoken as though her kindness were simply expected. No one asked whether she was tired. No one invited her to sit among the others. People appreciated what she did. Few seemed to think about who she was. As the evening slowly came to an end, families began gathering coats, blankets, and lanterns. Children carried leftovers wrapped in cloth, while wagons rolled toward the church entrance. Mary quietly stood and began collecting the remaining serving bowls. "I can help," Alvish offered. "You've already thanked me, that's plenty. I wasn't offering because I felt obligated. She looked at him. I know. Together they carried dishes into the small kitchen behind the church hall. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserves, sacks of flour, and neatly stacked cast-iron cookware used for community gatherings. Everything had its place. So, Alvish said as he dried a baking pan with a clean towel, how long have you lived here? Almost 6 years. And before that, my husband and I traveled west hoping to build a small homestead. She paused. He became ill during our second winter. I'm sorry. So was I. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The quietness in her eyes said enough. When he passed, she continued, I thought about leaving, but this little settlement had become the closest thing to home I had left. So you stayed. I stayed. And you've spent 6 years helping everyone else. She smiled gently. It keeps my hands busy. Her answer lingered with him, not because it sounded sad, because it sounded true. Outside, the last wagons were beginning to leave. The autumn sky glowed with shades of amber and violet as the sun settled behind distant hills. When the final dishes had been stacked, Mary untied her apron and folded it neatly into her basket. I suppose I'd better head home before it gets dark. Do you live far? About a mile east, just beyond Miller Creek. Walking. I always do. Without hesitation, Alvish picked up his hat. Then allow me to walk with you. She hesitated. People will talk. They already do. A smile escaped her despite herself. I suppose that's true. The two stepped outside into the cool evening air. Grass rustled softly beneath their boots. Crickets had begun their nightly song. For several minutes they walked in comfortable silence along the dusty road leading away from the church. Finally, Alvish spoke. Can I ask you something? Of course. When I asked who baked the cobbler. Why did no one answer right away? Mary looked ahead at the fading sunset. I don't think anyone meant harm. But, she chose her words carefully. People grow used to certain things. The church bell rings every Sunday. The school opens every Monday. Bread appears at gatherings. She smiled faintly. After a while they stop wondering who keeps those things going. And you've become one of those things? I suppose so. Alvish shook his head. I don't like that. She laughed softly. You've known me less than an hour. I've known enough. They reached a small white cottage surrounded by a vegetable garden and 2 aging peach trees whose leaves had already begun turning gold. It isn't much, Mary said. It's beautiful. She looked at him, unsure whether he truly meant it. He did. The little house wasn't grand. Its fence leaned slightly. The porch showed signs of years of careful repairs. But flowers bloomed beside the front steps. Every window was spotless, and the garden had been prepared for winter with remarkable care. It reflected the same attention she had given the peach cobbler, nothing extravagant, simply well-loved. Before leaving, Alvish reached into the pocket of his coat. I nearly forgot. He held out a few coins. I'd like to buy the last slice of cobbler. She blinked in surprise. There isn't much left. That's all right. I was planning to save it for tomorrow. He smiled. Then perhaps you'll bake another one someday. She looked at the coins, then gently pushed his hand back. If you come again, I'll bake one fresh. Their eyes met. It was a simple promise, nothing more. Yet it carried the quiet beginning of something neither of them fully understood. Alvish tipped his hat. I'll look forward to it. As he walked back toward town beneath the wide Texas sky, he realized he had arrived at the church expecting nothing more than an ordinary community supper. Instead, he had met a woman whose kindness had quietly strengthened an entire settlement without asking for recognition. And he found himself thinking that sometimes the rarest people were not hidden because they wished to be. They were hidden because everyone else had forgotten to look. That night, as Mary placed the last slice of peach cobbler on her small kitchen table, she caught herself smiling for no reason she could explain. For the first time in many years, someone had thanked her, not merely for the food she had prepared, but for the care, thought, and heart she had poured into it. It was only a conversation, only a walk home, only one ordinary evening on the Texas frontier. Yet both of them would remember it as the quiet beginning of a story that would change there the following Saturday. Alvish returned to Mary's little cottage carrying a cloth sack over one shoulder. He knocked gently, and after a moment the door opened. Mary looked surprised, then smiled when she recognized him. You came back. I said I would. She laughed softly. Most people say that, and most people forget. Sometimes. He lifted the sack. I brought fresh flour from the mill, a small bag of cinnamon, and a book of family recipes an elderly neighbor insisted I take. She said someone who enjoys baking ought to have it. Mary accepted the gifts with hesitation. You really didn't need to bring anything. They aren't payments. What are they? A reason to share another conversation. She stepped aside and invited him in. Her cottage was modest but welcoming. Sunlight poured through clean windows onto polished pine floors. A kettle simmered quietly over the stove, while shelves held carefully labeled jars of peaches, blackberries, herbs, and preserves gathered through the seasons. Everything had been arranged with patience rather than wealth. Over tea, they spoke about ordinary things, gardens, books, changing seasons, and the mountain trails Alvish knew so well. Mary listened with genuine curiosity, asking questions no one else had thought to ask. In return, she shared stories of recipes passed through generations, explaining how every meal carried a memory. Those visits became part of their weeks. Sometimes Alvish stopped by after delivering lumber to nearby settlements. Other times he simply walked the mile from town carrying something useful. A repaired lantern, vegetable seeds, fresh apples from a traveling merchant, or a newspaper from Fort Worth. He never arrived with expensive presents. He understood that kindness should never feel like charity. Instead, every visit felt like two friends sharing pieces of their everyday lives. Before long, Mary found herself looking toward the road each afternoon without realizing why. Meanwhile, people in town began to notice. At first, the whispers were harmless. The mountain man certainly enjoys peach cobbler. I've never seen him spend so much time visiting anyone. Soon, however, curiosity became assumption. Some believed Alvish pitied the young widow. Others claimed he would eventually grow bored and leave. A few quietly wondered why a prosperous man would choose someone who owned so little. Mary heard enough of those conversations while buying flour at the general store. None of the remarks were cruel, yet each one reminded her that people often judged appearances before character. That evening when Alvish stopped by as usual, she greeted him with the same warm smile, though her eyes carried unusual hesitation. "Is something troubling you?" he asked. She looked toward the window. "I think, perhaps it would be better if you didn't visit so often." He remained silent. "The town has started talking. Does that bother you? Not for myself." She folded her hands. "I don't want your reputation questioned because of me." Alvish smiled gently. "My reputation was built over many years." "Exactly. And it won't be harmed by spending time with an honest friend." She looked at him. "You make difficult things sound simple. Sometimes they are." Still, he respected her concern. Rather than arguing, he simply visited a little less often, choosing longer conversations whenever they did meet. One afternoon, while helping Pastor Whitmore repair shelves inside the church pantry, Alvish noticed several worn notebooks stacked inside an old wooden chest. "What are these?" "Kitchen records," the pastor replied. "Recipes and lists of meals prepared for community gatherings." Alvish opened one carefully. Each page recorded weddings, harvest suppers, school socials, and meals delivered to sick families. One name appeared again and again. Mary Dawson, peach preserves, bread, chicken stew, biscuits, pies, apple butter, soup, cookies for schoolchildren, meals for grieving families, harvest suppers, Christmas dinners. The entries stretched back nearly 6 years. "She prepared all these?" Pastor Whitmore nodded. "More than half, I'd say. Surely the church paid her." The pastor shook his head. "She always refused." Alvish slowly turned another page. Nearly every celebration the town remembered carried Mary's quiet fingerprints. Children had grown up eating food she prepared. New couples had celebrated weddings with her baking. Families mourning loved ones had found comfort through meals she quietly delivered. Yet few people ever spoke about her. They remembered the occasions, not the woman who had made them possible. That discovery stayed with Alvish for days. He never mentioned it to Mary. Instead, he began thinking about the pattern he had noticed ever since their first meeting. People appreciated kindness, but they often overlooked the kind person. One evening, while attending a church committee meeting, someone suggested organizing another harvest gathering before winter. Ideas bounced around the room. A music night, a quilting exhibition, a livestock showcase. Then Alvish spoke. "What if this time we celebrated the people behind the meals?" The room grew quiet. "What do you mean?" asked the pastor. "A frontier recipe fair." Several heads tilted with interest. "Not a cooking competition," Alvish explained. "A gathering where every cook stands beside their own table and tells the story behind a favorite family recipe. Every dish has a history. Every recipe belongs to someone. We spend years enjoying the food." Perhaps it's time we learned about the people who prepare it. The committee exchanged thoughtful glances. No prizes, no judges, only stories. Pastor Whitmore smiled first. I believe that's one of the finest ideas we've heard all year. The others slowly nodded in agreement. As the meeting ended, Alvish stepped outside beneath the clear autumn sky. He wasn't trying to change the town overnight. He simply hoped that once people paused to hear the stories behind familiar meals, they might finally notice someone they should have appreciated all along. And without realizing it, he was preparing a day that would forever change Mary's place in the community and in his own heart. The announcement of the Frontier Recipe Fair spread quickly through the settlement. By the end of the week, nearly every family had agreed to participate. Some planned to bring bread that had been made the same way for generations. Others prepared smoked meats, preserves, biscuits, or cakes whose recipes had traveled west in wagons alongside treasured family Bibles. Unlike previous gatherings, this one carried a simple request. Every cook would stand beside their own table and share the story behind the dish they had prepared. No prizes, no judges. Only gratitude. On the morning of the fair, the church hall looked brighter than ever. Fresh cedar branches decorated the entrance, while children arranged wildflowers in glass jars along the tables. Laughter filled the room long before the meal began. Mary arrived carrying her familiar cast-iron baking dish wrapped carefully in a clean cloth. Inside rested another peach cobbler. Golden, fragrant, perfectly baked. She quietly placed it on an empty table near the windows and started to step away. Pastor Whitmore smiled. "Not this time, Mary." She looked confused. Today every cook stays beside their recipe. A faint blush crossed her face. "I've never done that before. Neither has anyone else." He gently pointed toward the handwritten sign resting beside her dish. Mary Dawson, Mother's Autumn Peach Cobbler. She stared at the little card for several seconds. It was the first time her name had ever been displayed beside something she had made. Across the room, Alvish noticed her expression. He said nothing. He simply smiled. Families slowly entered the hall, moving from table to table. They listened as neighbors explained how certain recipes had survived difficult journeys across the frontier or reminded them of places they once called home. Children asked questions. Grandparents laughed while telling stories. Ordinary meals suddenly became windows into extraordinary lives. When visitors reached Mary's table, many paused because of the familiar aroma. "I remember this cobbler," one elderly rancher said. "You've made it for years." Mary nodded. "My mother taught me the recipe when I was 12. What makes it taste different?" She smiled gently. "I let the peaches speak for themselves." The small crowd chuckled. She continued. "My parents believed every harvest was a gift. We preserved the ripest fruit before the weather changed. Mother always said people shouldn't have to wait for special occasions to enjoy something made with care." Another woman asked quietly, "Is that why you always volunteer?" Mary thought for a moment. "When my husband passed away, I wasn't sure what to do with all the loneliness I carried." The room grew still. "So, I started cooking for other people." She rested one hand lightly on the baking dish. "I discovered that sharing a meal couldn't erase sorrow, but it could remind someone they weren't facing it alone." No one interrupted. There was nothing dramatic in her voice, only quiet honesty. An older man near the back slowly removed his hat. "You brought soup to our house after my wife passed," he said. "I've never forgotten that." A young mother stepped forward. "When my daughter was born early, someone left warm bread at our door every morning for a week." Mary smiled. "I thought you might need the rest more than another visitor." "It was you?" She nodded. Another voice joined in. "You baked pies for our school fundraiser, and cookies every Christmas. You prepared dinner when my brother broke his leg. You brought preserves after our harvest failed." One memory after another filled the hall. People weren't discovering something new. They were remembering. Each story uncovered another quiet act of kindness that had slowly disappeared beneath the routine of everyday life. Alvish stood near the doorway, watching without saying a word. This wasn't the recognition he had hoped people would give Mary. It was something deeper. It wasn't praise. It was understanding. For years, they had accepted her generosity as though it simply appeared by itself. Now they were finally seeing the person behind every thoughtful gesture. Pastor Whitmore stepped forward. "My friends," he said softly, "today was meant to celebrate recipes." He looked toward Mary, "But perhaps we've discovered something even more important." The room fell silent. "A good meal fills an empty stomach." He smiled kindly. A generous heart fills a community. Warm applause slowly spread through the church, not loud, not overwhelming, simply sincere. Mary lowered her eyes, unable to hide the tears gathering there. For the first time since arriving in the settlement 6 years earlier, she didn't feel invisible. As the afternoon drew to a close, neighbors lingered instead of hurrying home. Conversations that usually lasted only a few minutes stretched into hours. People exchanged recipes, shared memories, and laughed together as children carried empty serving dishes back to the kitchen. Again and again, someone stopped to thank Mary. Not because they suddenly felt guilty, because they finally understood how much of their happiest memories quietly included her. One little boy tugged gently at her sleeve. "My mama says you taught her how to bake biscuits." Mary smiled. She learned very quickly. "Will you teach me someday?" She laughed. "I'd be honored." Watching nearby, Alvish realized something his father had once told him as a young boy in the mountains. The strongest people rarely announce themselves. You find them by paying attention to how many lives grow better simply because they're nearby. He had never forgotten those words. Now they stood before him. As evening approached, families began returning home beneath a sky glowing orange and lavender. Mary carried her empty baking dish outside. Almost every crumb of cobbler had disappeared. Alvish caught up with her near the old oak tree beside the church. "I believe your recipe was the favorite." She smiled. "I think today wasn't really about the cobbler. No," he looked across the quiet settlement. "It was about the woman who baked it." For a moment, neither spoke. The gentle breeze carried the scent of cedar through the cooling air. Finally, Alvish turned toward her. "When I first asked who baked that peach cobbler, I expected someone to point me toward a good cook." She looked at him curiously. "Instead, they introduced me to the finest person I've met in many years." Mary's eyes glistened. "You hardly knew me. I noticed you." She laughed softly through happy tears. "There's a difference." "There is." He reached into his coat pocket and removed the small recipe book he had given her weeks before. "I'd like to ask you something." She waited quietly. "Would you consider filling the empty pages with your own recipes?" She smiled. "I suppose I could." "Good." He closed the book gently. "Because I hope one day our grandchildren will know who wrote them." For a heartbeat, Mary simply stared at him. Then she understood. Her smile became brighter than the evening sky. "I'd like that very much." Several months later, as winter gave way to spring, the little church welcomed neighbors once again. This time they gathered for a wedding. There were no expensive decorations, no grand displays. Wildflowers lined the windows. Fresh bread filled the tables. Children scattered flower petals along the aisle. Every family contributed a favorite dish inspired by recipes shared during the Frontier Recipe Fair. At the center of the longest table rested Mary's peach cobbler, not because tradition required it, because everyone insisted it belonged there. When Pastor Whitmore asked whether anyone wished to offer a blessing before the meal, the elderly rancher who had first remembered Mary's kindness stood slowly. "Years ago," he said, "we thanked heaven for the food." He smiled toward Mary. "Today I'd also like to thank the hands that have quietly fed our hearts for so many years." Heads nodded throughout the room, some smiled, others wiped away joyful tears. Alvish looked at his new wife with quiet gratitude. A single question about an ordinary dessert had changed both their lives. Not through fortune, not through adventure, but through something far rarer, the willingness to truly notice another human being. As the evening faded into laughter and music, the little frontier settlement felt different than it once had. People still worked hard. They still faced ordinary challenges, but they had learned an unforgettable lesson. Communities are not held together by the loudest voices or the wealthiest neighbors. They are built by ordinary people whose kindness often goes unseen, until someone chooses to ask a simple question, offer sincere gratitude, and remind everyone that every caring heart deserves to be noticed. And from that day forward, no gathering in the settlement was ever complete unless Mary Dawson's name appeared proudly beside whatever she lovingly prepared.